Hello everyone, Sakuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. If you can see the smile on my face right now, I promise you guys, to anyone who is watching, that this is a very fake smile because I'm actually very upset right now. I'm letting you all know that from the very beginning that the video that you're about to watch is not my first attempt, not my second attempt, not my third attempt to create this video. It is in fact the fifth attempt. And the reason why I am doing this right now, the reason why I'm saying it is my fifth attempt is because I have not lost the data or anything like that from any previous recordings. No, I have re-recorded this a couple times in different ways, trying to find a way that my video does not end up getting taken down or copyright claimed or any number of the other issues when it comes to this. Because Netflix, Universal Picture, and any of the other stuff that I use scenes of in order to be able to talk about the subject that I'm talking about today seem to want to take things down, or the stuff was just outright removed for inappropriate content when talking about things when it came to war. So now I had to sit back, go back, and do this entire thing from the very beginning, remove all the work that I have put into over the past couple days, and here we are. Censorship at its very finest, which is hilarious to think about considering that I'm sure that you've already seen the title of this video in the first place, because that is the thing that we're going to be talking about today. The censorship and the story behind All Quiet on the Western Front, which when talking about that, I'm going to be showing the scenes of it, but not actually the moving scenes. It's going to be the still frames of it because I cannot take the risk that another thing of this ends up getting taken down. And it just makes this entire thing incredibly ironic, as the subject of today's video is the censorship that All Quiet on the Western Front, one of the biggest, if not outright, the biggest war movie that was ever created in history, the most successful one. And from that, of course, the book in the first place, when talking about things historically, the censorship that it faced in real life is incredibly terrible. And it is a story that ends up being so dark and twisted that over the course of this video, you're going to hear me utilizing language that I do not want to use. When talking about certain groups or people or anything like that, you're going to hear me say things like the No-No Germans, the Yahtzee Party, and the Bad Mustache Man group. You're going to hear me use these phrases and things that I do not want to say. I really do not want to, but I have to use these words and other weird phrasings because otherwise the entire thing can just potentially be taken down here on YouTube. So my friends, to all of you who have watched this, who watch my program, who want to support me, thank you very much, as I greatly appreciate you. You're the only reason that I can even make this stuff here in the first place. If you could like, comment, and subscribe to show your support for the channel, you have no idea how much it means and just how frustrating all this was to try and create in the first place, and I would really appreciate your support. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into this thing here in the first place with a little bit of a summary. Now, when I say that I'm going to summarize this, I'm specifically referring to the 2022 movie. When we're talking about movies for All Quiet on the Western Front, there has actually been 3 now that have been created, along with, of course, the fact that there was the original book that was released back in, what, 1929, 1930? It is a very long-lived piece of media. But this is an epic war film, and the base media that we're talking about here is an anti-war creation that has had perhaps some of the biggest impact that you could possibly have in terms of war media in general. Every single time a version of one of these has been released, they win awards. And so needless to say, over the years, this work has been exceptionally impactful. But despite its huge amount of success, at one point in time, the book that all of these movies are based on at one point was banned in Germany. It was arguably top of the list in banned books in Germany at the time, which sounds weird. This very German book was banned in Germany, so the question then becomes of why? How did all of this go down in the first place? Well, in order to talk about that, as I said, we're going to need to summarize and kind of explain the story of what All Quiet on the Western Front is. For anyone who is unfamiliar with it in the first place and who is not looking for a summary, I apologize, we're effectively going to be spoiling it, but considering the amount of versions that have been out of this, you really should have already seen it by now or read it or something. It's that impactful and good. So the 2022 movie is set during World War I, and it follows the life of the idealistic young German soldier by the name of Paul Bäumer. And after he and his friends go and enlist in the German army, they end up experiencing the true realities and horror of war, which were very, very, very different than the glorious things that they had been promised by all of their school teachers and all of the propaganda that they had been consuming over the years as the war raged on. So now, instead of trying to become a hero, he and his friends were doing the best that they could to even survive in the first place. The story takes place in 1917. It's around 3 years into the war, and at the time, Paul and his friends are 17 years old. You have his friend Albert Kropp, Franz Müller, and Ludwig Bem, and they all listen to this patriotic speech that is given by their, school teacher. And then when they sign up, they end up receiving uniforms from soldiers who had been killed quite literally in the previous battle. But you know, they don't know that, and it's part of the whole horror of the entire thing. After all that, they end up getting deployed to the north, where they befriend another soldier by the name of Stanislaus Kat Kaczynski, who is an older soldier. And then their whole romantic view that they have of war is broken immediately on that first night because their friend Ludwig gets killed in an artillery strike. Literally, again, on the first night. We fast forward a bit of time and Germany is absolutely exhausted from the war. It's November 7th, 1918, and the German State Secretary Matthias Erzberger, who is extremely tired of the mounting losses that the German army is facing, he meets with the German High Command in order to persuade them to try and sign an armistice with the Allied powers. Meanwhile, at the same time that this is happening, Paul and Kat manage to go steal a goose from a farm, and they take it back to the front line in order to be able to share with all their comrades. At this point in time, the young boys are starting to become more jaded, and some of them are wondering whether or not they're even going to be able to return home and live normal lives. Fast forward a few days, and on November 9th, Erzberger and the German delegation ends up boarding a train in order to negotiate a ceasefire, and the entire time that this is happening, the soldiers on the front line are still fighting. Paul and his friends end up going on a mission in order to find 60 missing recruits that were sent to reinforce their unit, only to discover that they had all already been killed by gas because they took off their gas masks too early. And while all of this is happening, while all of this discussion of ceasefire is occurring and men are still dying, there is a German general called General Friedrichs who is opposed to the armistice talks, and he orders an attack before French reinforcements can arrive. He wants to be able to take as much territory as possible in order to end the war on the note of a German victory. On November 10th, the Supreme Allied Commander Ferdinand Foch would give the Germans 72 hours to accept the non-negotiable Allied terms, and meanwhile, the German attack that was launched on the French line would initially succeed before ultimately being driven out by the French, which would counterattack with Saint-Chamond tanks. Franz gets separated from the group, Albert gets unalived while trying to surrender. See, there's the whole point about language that I'm going to try and use over the course of this video. And as for Paul, he ends up getting trapped inside of a crater with another French soldier, and then after some hand-to-hand fighting, he ends up offing him. And because of how slow and long and drawn out of a process this is, and he sees it happening in front of him as it was hand-to-hand versus long distance, he begins to feel such incredible remorse and sadness and just awful about the entire thing, even begging for forgiveness once the soldier has long passed. Meanwhile, Erzberger learns of Kaiser Wilhelm II's abdication and receives instructions from Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg in order to just go ahead and accept the Allied terms. Meanwhile, Paul and Kat go back to their own line where they find soldiers that are celebrating the fact that the war is about to end, but then they find their friend Tjaden, who has been wounded, and instead of being able to pull through, Tjaden decides that he doesn't want to live life being potentially maimed, so he instead decides to remove himself from the situation utilizing the fork that was brought to him to allow him to eat, but instead he uses it on himself. Again, I can't really be very specific with the language that I'm using here, but you all know exactly what it is that I am stating. It's just YouTube is like this. On November 11th, Erzberger's delegation goes and signs the armistice set to take effect at 11 a.m. And after learning of the ceasefire, Paul and Kat decide to go and steal from that farm one last time, but then Kat ends up being blamed by the son of the farmer and then perishes on his way to the infirmary. Friedrichs, as I said earlier, specifically wants to end the war on the note of a German victory, and so even though there is only 15 minutes left before the war is over, he decides to instead order an attack. During this attack, Paul would take out as many French soldiers as he possibly could before he, in turn, in the trenches, would end up being taken out from behind. And that is the end of All Quiet on the Western Front, with every single character in it from beginning to end having expired. That is the story of All Quiet on the Western Front. It is not a romantic view of war. It is not a nice view of war. It's not a glorious view of war. It's instead something that just shows the harsh reality of it, where everything can and for many will go wrong. It is a story that is based on the real experiences of the author who fought for the Imperial German Army in the conflict. Even if the characters that we see in here were not actually real people, but were instead amalgamations of different people that experienced things in it that the author had seen. It is a very much German story. So then the question becomes, why did Germany hate it so much? Well, all right, I said I wasn't going to use any footage, but some of that is something that still has to be utilized in order to talk about what we're experiencing here. Well, as I said, it wasn't necessarily the Germans who hated this work. It was the no-no Germans whose names I am not allowed to say on here, apparently, because YouTube then takes an issue with it. And guys, I am still experimenting around with this channel, and I am really trying my best with this. it's something that is incredibly frustrating, and I appreciate all of you sticking with me. We're gonna come up with the most interesting names for all this that we can. I got No Germans, I got the Bad Mustache Men, and I have the Bad Yahtzee Party. If you have any other suggestions for names and other things that I should use for different terminology, please, I would love to hear it. Put your suggestions down in the comments below, and I'll probably start using a bunch of them in my videos. But these were the guys that really hated this book, and I'm going to need to kind of explain why, though I've already said a little bit of it. All Quiet on the Western Front was initially first serialized in 1928 in the German newspaper Vossische Zeitung. I know I'm mispronouncing it, but that's originally where it was. The book itself was then published on January 31st, 1929, and it was an immediate success. I mean, this thing was such a massive success that from the beginning it became a huge literary juggernaut, like from the very outset. In Germany alone, the initial print release of it sold out in the first day. You could not find it anywhere wherever you went. And over the course of the next couple weeks, around 20,000 additional copies would end up being sold. This would grow and grow and grow over time until by the end of the year, approximately 1 million copies of this book had been sold. Even when looking at things abroad, it was a huge hit. France and Britain accounted for like another 600,000 sales. And there was another 200,000 sales in America. And it's because of that immediate massive success that the film rights for the book were immediately bought for a record-breaking $40,000 by Universal Pictures, which the trailer for which you can see behind me here, but this thing has been its own massive pain trying to put up here in the first place. I mean, I can skip through some of the scenes so you can just see some of the stuff or how it would have looked in 1930, but this film was incredibly different from what people of the day and age were used to. And mind you, of course, we're talking about the year 1930. Motion pictures are still a very new thing in the first place, and oftentimes what governments had been doing in previous years was using propaganda reels in order to show off their power, their prestige, the glory of the army. This was not that at all. The audience would see people losing limbs. It would see horses being eradicated. They would see soldiers that were starving going through the garbage in order to try and find more food, along with the true horrors of what you would see with artillery and gas and everything else that made World War I such an incredibly nasty thing to be in. It is not romantic at all. It does not glorify war at all. And for the No Germans, that is precisely why they hated it. And that is why when the movie was actually set to premiere in Germany, the not fun Yahtzee party was there and ready for it. Before what it is that I had done when I was talking about this in my previous videos that I attempted to make, I had this trailer on repeat in the background just to kind of provide a little bit of the context of what people would have been seeing at the time. But I can't really do that now, so I'm just going to talk about the story of what happened at the premiere. So as audience, we're sitting down to watch this opening title comes on the 5th of December, 1930, which was just over 12 years after the end of World War I. You had German moviegoers that were flocking to Berlin's Mozart Hall in order to see the latest big Hollywood film, and it was something that test audiences who had seen it were absolutely stunned. But then in the middle of the movie, as everyone had sat down to actually watch it, around 150 Yahtzee brown shirts, nearly all too young to have actually fought in World War I in the first place, like these guys were not veterans at all, they ended up being led into the theater by propagandist Joseph Goebbels. And then while shouting anti-Semitic statements, they started attacking everyone inside of the theater. They would throw up sneezing powder, they would attack the projectors, they would release mice into the theater, even doing things like throwing stink bombs. Like, it was just absolute chaos. They did anything they possibly could in order to disrupt the show and attack it as something that was a Juden film, something that was being created by the enemy of the Yahtzee party in order to disparage the German state. I mean, you have to consider the timing of what we're talking about here. Only a few weeks prior to the December screening, the National Socialist German Workers' Party ended up surprising the nation by taking home a whopping 6.4 million votes. This was 18% of the total, and that is something that made the Yahtzee, whatever you want to call it at this time, it made them the second largest party in the entire country. And the campaign message that old No Mustache Man had was a very simple one. It was that he wanted to unite Germany and make it strong again, and that it wasn't Germany's fault that it was in the state that it was. No. It was a whole bunch of outside factors and saboteurs that they were the reason as to why Germany was suffering at this time. Which, considering the day and age in the midst of the Great Depression, this is something that really did resonate with voters. According to the Bad Mustache Man, there were treasonous Jewish Marxist revolutionaries at home that were to blame for Germany's defeat in the war, and what he wanted to do was to just tear up the Treaty of Versailles and revoke all of it. Mind you, when we're talking about this theory, the stabbed in the back theory, the entire thing is historical nonsense. But for the people of Germany that were tired and exhausted and embittered after the war, this is something that really did resonate with them. Resonate, that's the term. This was a war that had cost over 3 million lives, military and civilian, for Germany, and they wanted someone else to blame. It made it very easy for the Yahtzee not fun people to go and undermine the Weimar Republic in this way. Which of course then brings us back to the actual story of All Quiet on the Western Front. Like, this thing may have been a massive international bestseller, what to any country would have been something very prideful that a German had gone and created something like that. But the fact that this piece of work completely lacked any kind of pro-German propaganda in it, in fact, it showed Germans in not necessarily the most flattering light. It showed them in a realistic light, a sad light of the realities of war. Well, that was not something that the no-no party of Yahtzees wanted, and that made it a very easy target for them to go after. Over time, as the no-no Germans became more powerful within Germany, Remarque's acclaimed novel ended up becoming a proxy for everything that was wrong with the previous thought of the war in the German mind. For the no-no mustache man, it was simply impossible that the brave Teutonic soldiers of Germany could have ever been bested by any outside force. No. It was internal saboteurs of these undesirables that were to blame. There is no way that his soldiers could have achieved anything other than a magnificent victory if it wasn't for those. And this kind of nationalistic rewriting of history is something that really took a hold of the battered German people at this time. The real horrible thing about all of this is that it was a complete reframing of the thought of World War I, not as something that had been basically a meaningless slaughter in which millions of people were sacrificed for basically no gain, but instead something that had been a noble German enterprise that had been sabotaged, and if only we did things a little bit differently, then we would truly succeed and be great. It really is just incredibly tragic. But okay, going back to the story of the theater and Goebbels and whatnot, the really funny part about all of this is that it wasn't actually the first premiere in Germany. The film had actually managed to debut a day earlier on December 4th in Germany in theaters, and when this happened, well, it went really quite well. Of course, what had happened is that when it premiered, knowing that potentially this could create an issue, the German police were heavily patrolling the area and made sure that there were no disturbances at it. And according to some reporters who had viewed the scene, that when the lights finally came on and everyone stood up, there was no applause, there was no booing, there was no nothing. The audience was simply too stunned to speak from seeing it. But what Goebbels had managed to correctly guess was that while the initial premiere was something that was going to be protected, if nothing happened on that first night, the thing that was anticipated to be significantly bigger, then that means that the German police was not going to have nearly as large of a presence for any future events. Thus, the very next day, on the 5th, well, they were prepared. I mean, the mob attack that they launched at that time went beyond anything that you could say is simply a protest or a prank. It wasn't anything like that. It wasn't just sneezing powder. It wasn't just stink bombs or anything like that. They were physically assaulting people, breaking the projectors, and doing everything that they could in order to create as much harm as possible. And it's really ironic when talking about things in this film, because Goebbels, this guy over here, he wasn't someone who had ever actually fought in World War I. He was smaller, he had a club foot, he had a number of physical issues that there was just simply no way that he could have ever actually qualified to serve in the military. Something that for the rest of his life would be a great mark of shame. It's one of the reasons why he got so into propaganda as he did, which meant that when it came to All Quiet on the Western Front, this was something that for him that he more than likely had a personal vendetta against it, not just as being anti-German, but something that was a direct insult to him. He would later write in his diary that very night, quote, "Within 10 minutes, the cinema was a madhouse. The police are powerless. The embittered masses are violently against the, can I even say it like this, or is that also something that is going to be flagged? Individuals of Jewish descent." We're gonna say, god dang, I don't even know what it is that I'm allowed to say here at this point. Goebbels would end up leading a bunch of torch-wielding hooligans basically for the next few days, as other riots all over the country would end up breaking out. In Vienna, around 1,500 police would have to surround the Apollo Theater and withstand a mob of several thousand forces that were trying to disrupt the movie. Forces of the bad mustache party thing. But it didn't matter, because all over the country, wherever it is that they went, there was still going to be violence and vandalism and everything else that would occur. And although other disturbances across the country would occur, there was simply nothing that was as strong as when the brown shirts and other forces were involved. By the week's end, the Supreme Board of Censors in Germany ended up reversing the original decision that they had made. Initially, they wanted the movie to play and had allowed it, but after the massive series of violence everywhere, that's just not something that they could allow. So they ended up up going and banning All Quiet on the Western Front, despite the fact that Universal Pictures had already revised the film a bit. They sanitized its image by going and removing some of the scenes of trench warfare and some of the more brutal parts, while also at the same time removing the parts that directly blamed Kaiser Wilhelm for causing the war in the first place. But that didn't really matter at this point. Really, it's an ironic part about this film that just as it was banned in Germany for being anti-German by certain groups, it was simultaneously banned in Poland, can you guess it, for being pro-German. As though it showed them in a more sympathetic light, like, you know, that they were human. Man, these soldiers aren't just evil beings, they're real people who actually suffer and have to deal with tragedy, you know? Over the course of all of this, throughout all the different events, the violence, the everything that was happening, Remarque would end up staying quiet during it, something that he would later definitely come to regret. Apparently, one of the things that had even happened during this whole incident is that a Yahtzee official ended up actually going to him and asking him to please confirm that the publishers had ended up selling the rights to his book for film to Universal Pictures, that they did all of that behind his back and without his actual permission. The idea, of course, that the Yahtzees were going to be trying to push at that point is that, oh no, this German book that is not actually as bad as anything. No. It was something that had just been sold out by Jewish individuals within the media. And if you had signed off on that, then that means that Goebbels would have been able to use it as propaganda. Something that in exchange for, he would end up getting some level of protection from the party, which he ultimately would just refuse. And it would only get worse from there. Because on the night of May 10th, 1933, around 4 months after the No-No Germans ended up coming to power in Germany, the No-No Germans would end up going around to all the different bookstores, the libraries, and basically any kind of place that sold media, or at least gave out media for people to read or consume, and then they would end up burning all of it in massive pyres. We're talking around something along the lines of 25,000 books ended up being burned during this, something that was described as a cleansing of the German spirit. Students would scream into the night, condemning each author as they would toss the books into the pile, while also chanting other anti-Semitic or other slogans depending on whatever target they were going after. Which, okay, all right, so all of this happens to the books, but what about the author? We said that he would come to regret it. Well, the issue with Remarque is that he wasn't communist, he wasn't Jewish, he wasn't anything like that these particular Germans should have had any kind of issue with. But he was in Berlin on January 31st, 1933, when the ultimate no-no mustache man was appointed as Supreme Chancellor. I guess the term is not supreme, I'm probably associating things more with Star Wars at that point. He was appointed Chancellor, like he got the job. And so Remarque over here ends up getting tipped off that these new Yahtzee people that are in power, well, they don't like him and they're more than likely coming after him, so he needs to book it. He needs to get out of there as soon as possible. Which he does. He drives through the darkness in order to escape from the country and makes it all the way to a home that he has in Switzerland. And it's a good thing for him, at least, that he did, because by the end of that very year, the No-No Germans would make owning a copy of All Quiet on the Western Front a criminal offense. Both that and also its sequel, The Road Back. Any private copies that were held by individuals had to be turned over to the Gestapo on threat of, well, the fact that you're going to get arrested, and this is not something that you wanted to happen in Germany at this time. Definitely not. Which actually, side note, I probably should talk about that, but that whole thing with The Road Back, the sequel, like, we're calling it a sequel, but it wasn't a real sequel in the sense that it was following the same characters, because obviously none of those survived. This was a different book that took place directly after the events of All Quiet on the Western Front. And although it follows different characters, one can assume they're from the same company because the characters from within this story do remember the characters of All Quiet on the Western Front. And set only a few weeks after the end of All Quiet on the Western Front, the novel then deals with the fall of the German Empire and the experiences of young men in Germany who now have to go back home from the front, defeated, to a place that, well, they barely recognize anymore. It is a book that is extremely pessimistic and critical of contemporary society, and honestly, when you would look at things from how the Germans would feel after this time, it's just more defeatist talk for them to want to get rid of. So, like the other book, it was also banned. Remarque would then end up finishing his trilogy of German war books with something called The Three Comrades, which is a tale of 3 German soldiers who end up opening an auto body shop and fall for the same dying woman. Like The Road Back, this thing was also adapted into film and would achieve a large degree of success, and like like the others, was also then something that was not allowed in Germany. So you have to think that at this time, Remarque is a very successful author with 3 very successful books and simultaneously 3 films that were made from his 3 books. That is some incredibly good luck to have, you would think. But as things began to heat up in Europe, he realized that he wasn't necessarily going to be all that safe inside of Switzerland, and so instead he decided to flee from there going into the late 30s to America instead. And there in 1939, he would end up having relations with, well, a very large number of actresses. It could be said that at the time that his appetites were arguably insatiable. Dancers, actresses, married women, not, it didn't really matter. He was with anyone he could get with. And so the thing is, as World War II was raging on around him, Remarque was living the high life that was completely unknown to his family that he had left behind in Europe. And simultaneously from that, his family would end up suffering significantly more than he ever possibly did. His brother-in-law ended up becoming a prisoner of war. His father's second wife would end up offing herself, but the thing that really would haunt him is what would end up happening to his younger sister. So at this point, I'm going to read this directly because what we're talking about gets a little bit murky at this point. But in September of 1943, Elfriede, who was a fashionista dressmaker living in Dresden, was turned in by her landlady and arrested by the Gestapo for, quote, defeatist talk. This was something that, especially going into the later parts of the war, was something that the Germans would really crack down on because they didn't want anyone to potentially be sabotaging them from the inside, as that was something that they took very seriously, considering everything that we've talked about in this episode already. She was also charged with subversion of military strength, and as a result of that, she was sentenced to death in a sham trial as a dishonorable, subversive propagandist for our enemies, end quote. What followed this was that on December 12th, she was summarily executed by a guillotine. That is the end of the concrete evidence that we have of it, but there are secondhand stories about the whole scenario that paint an even darker picture. That apparently some witnesses would say that at the end of the trial, the judge would state, and I quote, "We have sentenced you to death because we cannot apprehend your brother. You must suffer for your brother," end quote. As a result of all this, Remarque would end up dedicating his 1952 novel A Spark of Life to his sister, but this dedication was something that in a final twist of the knife was actually removed from the German version of the publication because there were still many people there that saw him as a traitor who had left the country. As for the book and film that would start his massive career, these were things that would end up becoming stunning successes, as I'm pretty sure from everything that we've talked about, you can already guess at. It is estimated that to this day, approximately 30 to 40 million copies of All Quiet on the Western Front have been sold. And the film that you would see here would win that year's Academy Awards for Best Director and Best Production, and still to this day is regarded as one of the greatest war films that has ever been made. The 2022 movie, if you have not seen it, is more than likely not going to be the last one that ends up getting made. This is a story that resonates with people all across time and is something that we are going to see time and time again. Remarque would use his personal experience as a German soldier in order to write All Quiet on the Western Front. He was drafted at the age of 18. He fought on the Western Front of World War I, and there he would witness many of the atrocities that you were going to see depicted inside of the novel. All Quiet on the Western Front is a story of disillusionment. It is the harsh reality of war without any of the propaganda or glory that is stated by governments all throughout time. And it is because of this, because it is anti-war without actually being anti-war, it is neutral and just shows the horror of it, that is why it is so powerful even to this day. And the idea of censoring that, of taking that image away, is something that I never want to see happen. And it's why making this entire thing has proved to be so incredibly frustrating for me. No matter what time period we're talking about, this is a valid perspective. And I ask that any of you who have been watching this to please like, comment, subscribe, do anything you can to help this video in the algorithm. Simultaneously, if you want to support me now that we're here at the episode's end, if you want to check out my Patreon down in the description below, I'd greatly appreciate that. And simultaneously, on an ad note, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm going to be leading a trip to Italy here this next spring in May. So if you want to join me on that trip, please see the link down in the description below, because there's only a couple early bird spots left that get a bit of a discount, and I really would like to see all of you there if you can. And if you really want to support my channel, then please do check out my coffee. I have my own coffee series here, and it is chocolatey and delicious, and I promise that you're going to enjoy it. So please, click the links down in my description below. Thank you all for watching, and please put in the comments what it is that you think we should do next, along with I'm waiting for all of those descriptions of words that I'm not allowed to say, so that hopefully, for the love of God, please, I've been working on this for the past 2 days, please, please, please do not let this video get taken down YouTube. Come on, this is anti-censorship. That is the purpose of this story. But thank you everyone, and goodbye.